Postmodern architecture is difficult to define. On one hand, it's postmodern, coming after what we refer to as the modern era in architecture, the early and middle parts of the 20th century. It also suggests in the post a rejection of what it meant to be modern in architecture. And certainly some history textbooks you'll read will suggest that there is a huge break, a schism between modern and postmodern architecture. More recently, however, we can see now that in fact, while there were changes, there was really no schism, and many of the threads of modern architecture continue through to contemporary design today. There were, however, some pretty significant ruptures and adjustments that happened through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in architecture that reframed the goals and objectives. One key thing is the idea that instead of one universal rule, so think of Siam trying to make a rule, some universal set of principles, the Athens Charter, that would be able to offer guidelines to designers in designing the functional city. Well, modern architecture says that a set of universal principles is possible. Postmodern architecture suggests that one set of principles just won't work. Now, of course, you'll recall in our discussion of Siam that Team 10 was already pushing for a more contextual and site-specific engagement with design. And so, again, not that huge schism, but definitely some shifts that we're going to look at today. Another thing that we see in postmodernism is that with the breakdown of this idea of the universal, the field, the architectural field, and many of its allied fields, begin to look for other sources of truth. Where is meaning? So if it can't be one universal rule, what's it going to be? And one of the first places that we see a direct importation of ideas is from linguistic theory, specifically structuralism. Now, structuralism is an intellectual movement that developed in France in the 1950s. We don't see it in architecture for at least another decade. But the linguistic theory of structuralism is based on the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, and he studied the structure and meaning of language. His ideas about language, semiotics, were then used to try to understand human culture. In architecture, we see the application of structuralism as an attempt to analyze architecture as a complex system of interrelated parts. So in structuralism we see this desire to understand pieces, bits of architecture, and how they come together to create form. Now, within this definition of structuralism in architecture, I hope you notice that we still are looking for universals, right? There's a complex system, but it's a system, something that we can understand, organize, tabulate, maybe even make charts, tables. Again, this idea of a structure that underlies everything that we do. Some examples of structuralism in design include buildings that we've already studied. For example, Louis Kahn's Salk Institute, modular, symmetrical, structurally rational. This is structuralism. It's based on this idea of the module that's then repeated. Right? This is a alphabet of forms that we see expressed on the page. And in this case, in the building. Right? So it doesn't matter what language or what area of architecture you're working in, there are elements of language that are shared, that are universal. Now, following these ideas, which caused a great deal of excitement in architecture, in the 1960s we see the emergence of post-structuralism. Again, as with postmodernism, this suggests that post-structuralism is sort of a reaction to structuralism or against it. In fact, I would like you to think of it as more of an extension. Many of the same ideas are shared, but there's some pretty critical differences. The first is that post-structuralists felt that no one philosophical system could arrange and explain man's knowledge. This is that rejection of universalism and the universal rule. And post-structuralism also argues that there were no absolute standards in any field of inquiry. There is always uncertainty. So this is when we look at this, we see that this is a rejection. Here we see a rejection of the notion there can be one universal rule, that there can be one set of underlying structures. Instead, there's a proliferation, that some may be shared, but there's always the potential for uncertainty. Another element of post-structuralism is the idea of determinism. And that's the notion that landscape and architecture choices will result in particular behaviors. And it implies a simple cause-effect relationship between environment and behavior. So I'm sure you've heard things like, well, in that the room was so poorly lit, I couldn't think. Or that urban square was so poorly designed that it is rife with crime. Well, that is the notion of physical determinism. So there's a causal effect between space and behavior. This also suggests, of course, that if you can design well, you can control how people behave. Emerging from post-structuralism, we have this idea of text as discourse. And this comes down, there are many sort of complicated threads that are debated here, but the key idea I want you to take away is that with this idea of text as discourse, you could deconstruct a text, so break it down to its elements, and then understand its signs and symbols, and create entire networks of uncertainty. Now, if we think of this as a building, these are building components. The idea that you could break it down to its simple elements to create a new network, and that there would be uncertainty, and you could make people feel maybe a bit uncomfortable about the way the building looks because you are playing with their notion of what architecture should be. Therefore, a text or a building could be interpreted in any number of ways. Interpretations are ultimately relative. There's no one truth, there's no one judgment of beauty. It's all relative to the frame of reference. So with these ideas in mind, this is a little bit of architectural theory that architects brought into the field from semiotics, from linguistic theory, and it had a pretty distinct effect, this idea of relativism. It shook up the field. So we still see modern threads, as you're going to see when we talk about the New York Five next, but we're also going to see the emergence of all sorts of other interpretations of what architecture should and could be. So, the New York Five, and you'll notice the date here is 1969, and there was a conference held at MoMA, and it was a conference of architects for the study of the environment. And in attendance, so participating in the conference, were architects Michael Grave, Peter Eisenman, Richard Meyer, Charles Gwathmey, and John Hedgeshook. And they were known as the New York Five. And here you can see them. Growing out of this conference, there is a book published called Five Architects that set forth the group's allegiance to serious modernist theories. So these architects chose to take on very modern approach, so what we talk about high modernism in architecture in their work. This project is the Gwathmey Residence and Studio, and designed by Charles Gwathmey, part of the New York Five, and he designed this for his parents in 1965. The house was located on a 1-acre flat site in eastern Long Island. It's quite close to the ocean, and it at the time was surrounded by undeveloped land. This was Gwathmey's very first residential project, and, as is often the case with doting parents, Gwathmey was given the freedom by his parents to have full control of the design, as long as it was within their $35,000 budget. Yes, very hard to imagine a home being built for $35,000, but back in the 60s, this was absolutely possible. Gwathmey intended for the house to be sort of a sculpture on the site, and he approached this by carving out primitive forms, such as cubes, to create different spaces. The carving of these spaces was determined by responses to the site, so solar orientation, program, structure. The intended spaces for the original 1,200 square foot house were a living and dining space, kitchen, master bedroom and studio, 2 guest bedrooms, and a workroom. Due to the limited budget, a partie and vernacular were developed for the house so that this system could later be used for future construction. The design was approached in section, which created a vertical scheme and organization of the home, which I think you can see quite well in the image to the right. The house is divided into 3 distinct levels: the base, which is the location of the workroom, the covered terrace, and the guest rooms. Then there's the habitable level, which contains living room, dining room, and kitchen, and finally the 3rd level, which is also the most private space, which has the master bedroom and studio that are pushed back with a balcony overlooking the double-height living room. That's the image you see there. By making the 2nd level more public, Gwathmey established a new relationship between public space and the ground level, creating a situation unique from conventional residential projects. Now, looking at these images, I hope you recognize, of course, a very clear, a very rational modern aesthetic. Yet, we don't see Le Corbusier pilotis. We do see the orthogonal boxy element that was quite common, but you're also starting to see something maybe a little more playful. The development of cubes and partie, for example, the curve of that stair, that is more sculptural. Something that one does associate with high modernism. Certainly Le Corbusier has curves in his work. Think of the architectural promenades in some of his projects. But also, where the wall is cut and opened, we've got ribbon windows, we have square windows, sort of a playful repertoire, but still very much within that modern aesthetic. This, of course, places Gwathmey within that New York Five. Another designer within the group was Richard Meyer, and he designed this house, the Smith House in Darien, Connecticut. It's located on the coast, as you can see in the image, of Long Island Sound, and this is what Meyer thought of being a modernist lighthouse of transparent geometry. The architectural critic Kenneth Frampton called it, quote, a panoramic belvedere overlooking the rocky shoreline, unquote. A work of neo-purist architecture that harked back to the best of Le Corbusier. This was one of Meyer's first major residential projects, and the house also represents a turning point in his career. So looking more closely now at the house itself, you'll notice the white cube, the sheets of glass, the use of a grid in places to cut out and close down the facade. The image on the right reveals the openness of the plan. You'll also notice that everything is white. This is the idea of that very white, rational, modernist design. And Meyer was quoted as saying, quote, I believe the success of the house lies in the capacity to absorb and enter into dialogue with the temporal phenomenon of light and context. They are, in the end, its materials." Unquote. Meyer became well known for this sort of architecture, these white cube, modernist homes, for typically the very wealthy. Peter Eisenman, yet another member of the New York Five, is legendary for his four-house experiments. And these are an example of pure theory. So this is architecture as theory. And for him, this is pure theory rendered on a domestic scale. And I will note, we had sort of notoriously mixed results. And what you're seeing here is he would take a cube and then through a series of rational geometric manipulations would change its configuration. So there are multiple versions of what the outcome could possibly be depending on the type and number of manipulations that took place. Joseph Rosa, the curator of architecture and design at San Francisco's Museum of Modern Art, said that this was Eisenman's first freestanding building, and it was a kind of kickoff project. Rosa goes on to say, quote, "Eisenman was helping architecture rethink itself and become self-critical," unquote. And here you can get a better sense of the manipulation of the cube and the grid, and the decision-making process was very methodical and very rational. While many of the house studies were unbuilt, some were, and here we can see one. One thing about architecture as pure theory is in these designs, Eisenman really did not consider how the building would function for its user. This was architecture as architecture, and had no consideration of it as architecture as a space for living. This is probably one of the chief criticisms of Eisenman's projects in this period. Now, what comes out of the New York Five is an interesting debate in the early 1970s. So in reaction to the book Five Architects, a critical essay titled, quote, "Five on Five," unquote, appeared in the May 1973 Architectural Forum, and it rejected the black and white worldview of the New York Five. In other words, the essay rejected the abstraction, formalism, and purity of these modernist principles. Summing up the positions of the Greys, as they were known, Robert A.M. Stern wrote, "Grey buildings have facades which tell stories. These facades are not the diaphanous veils of orthodox modern architecture, nor are they the affirmation of deep structural secrets," unquote. This statement is in direct opposition to the idea of the Whites, or the New York Five, as these modernists were called. While the two groups were not completely polar in their views, the lively debate they fostered gained momentum and attracted media attention over the coming years, and may even have helped to establish some of these architects as future starchitects, as you'll see a bit later in the lecture. Now, a couple of other comments about the Whites versus the Grey debate. There was two strong reactions against modern architecture and its aspirations towards an architectural language. Both movements stand in opposition to the ordered rationality of modernism. The first and most extreme form was characterized by the Greys, which were known for their postmodern way of thought. The Grey ideology began with theory and practice of Robert Venturi. His publication, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, argues against the purity, simplicity, and clarity of modernism. The second reaction is most clearly represented by the work of Peter Eisenman and four other architects known as the Whites. Peter Eisenman attempted to address the more basic questions of language, the grammatical questions. quote, "What are the limits, qualitatively and quantitatively, to the lexicon of architectural signs? What makes certain configuration architectural? Which shape can or cannot be used? And more important is how should these shapes be articulated?" Unquote. So, if the roots of modern architecture lie in functionalism and rationalism that drove architects to design buildings based on their purpose, then the greatest achievement of this later postmodern artistic movement was to understand the limitations of functionalism. So let's look a little bit more at this idea of postmodernism. In particular, I want to look a bit more at the work of Robert Venturi and his partner and wife, Denise Scott Brown. Now, their most important contributions to the field are really in two pivotal books in architectural theory. The first was Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, written by Venturi, and the second is Learning from Las Vegas, written by both Venturi and Scott Brown. I should note that Complexity and Contradiction was written as a book about architectural theory and the moment in which Venturi found himself working. And Learning from Las Vegas actually emerged from a studio that Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi taught at Yale University. And so you'll see that they are a bit different in their findings. So in the middle of the 1960s, few critics were questioning the received orthodoxy of modernist theory. But Robert Venturi's 1966 book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, served as an early manifesto against strict black and white modernism. Venturi called for more richness and ambiguity and proposed that architects should consider black and white and sometimes gray, hence the name The Grays. Rebutting Mies van der Rohe, he declared, "Blatant simplification means bland architecture. Quote, less is a bore." Unquote. Robert Venturi goes on to explain the need for ornament in his second book called Learning from Las Vegas, published in 1972. Writing with Denise Scott Brown, Venturi states decorative elements, quote, "accommodate existing needs for variety and communication." Unquote. He stresses that the building needs to communicate a meaning to the public. Postmodernists, in general, strive to achieve this communication through their buildings. The communication, however, is not intended to be a direct narrative of the meaning. Venturi goes on to explain that it is rather intended to be a communication that could be interpreted in many ways. It's relative. Because work of such quality will have many dimensions and layers of meaning. So in this way, in Book 1, he advocates eclectic design that's open to the influence of history. Don't get rid of history. Look at popular culture. Look at popular design. Look at commercial architecture. And then in his second book, Scott Brown and Venturi call architects to pay more attention to common architecture, the everyday, and symbolism of popular culture. So, looking back at modern architecture, Venturi says less is a bore. Less is more, is what they would have said then, right? Mies van der Rohe, less is more. And Venturi says no, less is a bore. And he didn't want to just look at pure cubes or ribbon windows or pilotis. Instead he said no, look at the mess and lights and color of a real city. And that is why, for his Yale studio, they went and looked at the city of Las Vegas. And so this is an image of the Strip in the late 60s, early 70s. It's quite different today, of course. But you can see the overlapping layers, the signage, the color, the traffic, the speed. And he had his students go about mapping the city. And this is an example of just one of the really stunning maps that the Scott Brown Venturi studio put together. And you can see how here they're mapping out some of the signage. And it's text. They're layering this text onto the strip. And looking at it here, you can see some starker, larger, bolder, and this is depending on its size and its impact. For the car traveling, what can you learn from this? What does this tell you about the way this space is used? How would you design for this kind of space? Now, with their interest in science, it's not surprising that Venturi and Scott Brown were very interested in linguistic theory, so structuralism. And semiotics, as we discussed a few minutes ago, is the study of signs and symbols and how they create meaning through systems. And Venturi and Scott Brown sought to extend this method of analysis to architecture and urbanism. And their conclusions are such. And here you can see another one of their graphics from their book. Buildings represent meaning in two primary ways. Buildings can be ducts, or buildings can be decorated sheds. What does this mean? Well, the duck is a building that is its sign. Meaning and morphology are one. The building itself represents its meaning, in other words, and so ducts are symbols themselves. A duck building is one that can't be anything but what they are, and their shape foretells the activity that takes place inside. So you know what happens there. No textual signage is really required, and they often blur the lines between building and sculpture. It is called Duck after the Duck Building in Long Island, and a duck building has innate ornamentation and are honest and straightforward in their intentions. In other words, what you see is what you get, and what you get is what you would expect. A decorated shed, by comparison, is a building where the sign is separate, and the meaning of the building is applied to the facade through some kind of sign. Meaning is contained within the sign, therefore the form of the architecture becomes unimportant. A decorated shed is somewhat generic structure with a purpose identifiable only by its signage. In fact, decorated sheds could not exist without signs and other applied ornamentation. Unlike ducks, they are not symbols themselves, but require this applied symbol. The ornamentation is explicit and serves to distract the viewer from the true, uninteresting structure. Is it a clothing store, a restaurant, a hotel? Just check the sign. So here's some examples of decorated sheds and examples of ducks. Now this is a clear example of literalism in advertising. Now, Venturi and Scott Brown have a number of quite wonderful projects that we will not have an opportunity to look at in detail, but I do want to look through a few quickly. Many of you are familiar with the Vanna Venturi House from earlier courses. This is just a reminder. This is Venturi alone, so Scott Brown actually did not design this. This is a home for his mother, and in it, he picks up on all sorts of historical elements and combines them in very unusual and unexpected ways. And that is the point. Venturi knows history. He knows the tropes. He knows the elements that one looks for in a home. And then he toys with expectations. It's almost mannerist, if you think back to your HDE2 course, in mannerism where you would see the playing with the classical canon, right? A slipped keystone, for example. And the same is happening here with the Vanna Venturi house. You'll remember on the inside there's the disappearing stair, or the stair to nowhere. It's a very small home. Light was very important. You'll notice the use of clean materials. A modern aesthetic, yet warmed by the use of wood, and of course very unusual geometries. This is not just a white cube. So from the Vanaventuri House and from the two books we've just looked at, we start to get an understanding of some characteristics of postmodern architecture. One of the primary things is nonlinearity. So there are multiple styles and multiple goals. We are going to start to see the influence of digital technologies and the inclusion of world cultures. So elements coming from non-Western traditions. From visual culture, we get fine art, craft, and advertising enmeshed in postmodern design. And in visual studies, the combination of visual culture and social theory. This is a good time to remind you that postmodernism is not just in architecture, but in fact was a much larger cultural shift in theory. And here is a larger list of postmodern characteristics. And I'll just highlight a few for you, but please read through these. So first, postmodern architecture rejects the notion of pure or perfect detail. Instead, remember, there can be multiple interpretations. Maybe something even a little unsettling. They use color again and move away from neutral white colors. Now, in modern architecture, there's color as well, but the palette often moved to sort of a white, spare design. We begin to see the reemergence of surface ornament and references to the past that had been missing from many modern buildings. And they favored subjective truths, so personal variety. There's not one universal, remember. Can't be objective. Design, interpretations of beauty, those are going to be, to a great degree, understood through the eye of the beholder. So who are some of these postmodern designers? Well, the first I just want to mention is Michael Graves. And you'll notice here I titled this From White to Disney. Well, he was one of the New York Five. And you can see on the image on the upper left, here's one of his homes that he designed in that sort of white modernist style. And he did this very successfully until he shifted gears somewhat suddenly. And as you can see in this quote, he said, "Good design should be accessible to all." One of his first postmodern buildings in 1982 is the Portland Public Service Building. And you can see here the use of color, the very unusual facades. In fact, what he was doing was toying with historical references. On the one side, you can see the keystone. You can also see the very unusual looking pilasters, which are actually just surface ornament, the material on the facade. So the use of geometry and historical references in a very abstracted and sort of playful way. And for many, the way that they interpret postmodern architecture is that it brought play and fun back into design. Another building he designed was the headquarters for Disney. And you can see here in the project that in fact the 7 dwarves are holding up the pediment. This kind of playfulness, of course, very appropriate for Disney and would not have been seen in a modern architecture. Also note the use of color here, the different glazing systems, much more playful and open to multiple interpretations. Michael Graves went on to design lines of household items for Target, and here are a few of them. And this brings full circle his idea that good design should be available to all. Another important figure in postmodernism is the architect Philip Johnson. He, of course, you'll remember, was one of the curators of the International Style exhibition at MoMA in 1932. And he was, in fact, a celebrated champion of modernism who had also mentored Michael Graves. But he also shifted gears around this period and joined the postmodern dialogue with his own bold and ironic statements. In his design for the AT&T building in New York City, now the Sony building, he placed an antique Chippendale highboy ornament element atop a modern high-rise tower. So he's playing these different things. And you'll also see, so there on the left is his glass house that he designed for his own home. And then, that's very modern, obviously. And then now on the right, his new sort of postmodern, more playful, historically referenced building on the right. So just an important reminder, Philip Johnson is a pivotal figure in the 20th century. He curated that International Style exhibition in 1932. He also worked with Mies van der Rohe on the Seagram building in the 50s. And then in the 70s, shifts gears and designs the AT&T building. He always seemed to have his finger on the pulse of the latest design strategies. And here you can see the base. Again, very unusual and certainly not what one would expect from an international style skyscraper. Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano's Pompidou Center is another example of postmodern architecture. This was built in 1977. In fact, it's one of those buildings that I always think should be more recent than it really is. If you look at it, you can very clearly see that their goal was to create something that was inside out. The pipes and the supports are all exposed, and color is used here to code different things, so different service elements. You know, is an escalator? Is it a hot water pipe? Is it air conditioning? So green indicates water, blue indicates air conditioning, and elevators and escalators, so circulation, are marked with red. This is an interesting hybrid building. It demonstrates modernist architecture with its steel support beams and functionality, but it's also a mixture of influences. It turns things inside out. It reveals things that one would not normally see. The way that structure becomes decoration, that it's sort of playful. Look at the way those pipes run along in the lower image. That is postmodernist. And at night, it sort of lights up like an ornament. Robert A.M. Stern was one of the most vociferous opponents of the whites and saw himself firmly in the gray camp. He did many projects. Here I'm just showing you one. This is Disney's Newport Bay Club in 1982. And you can see that he's harkening back to sort of a nostalgic architecture, sort of coastal architecture, which was of course never built on this scale or for this purpose. But he's looking at history, he's looking at context, and he's working with this in a way that had not been done in sort of the modern period. Another important postmodernist is James Stirling. He also considered himself a modern architecture. However, the work that he created was this interesting bridge. This is the Staatsgalerie that he designed in 1984 in Stuttgart, Germany. And what you're seeing here on the left is a courtyard, the sculpture courtyard in the middle. And on the right, this is the facade. This is sort of the anti-facade. It doesn't really have a formal facade in the way we would imagine a modern building. In this next slide, you get a better sense for the different volumes, the use of color, the playful angles, the exposed structure. But is it structure or is it ornament? So these are the kinds of questions and uncertainties that postmodern architecture wanted the viewer to be asking themselves. Now, just one point about the urbanism of this project, which makes it such an exciting and interesting one. If you look at the plan, so this is the site plan in the upper right, you'll see the building in the middle with the circular courtyard, and you'll notice that there is a ramp pictured on the bottom right image, a ramp that moves from the higher elevation of the top street through the courtyard and then lets out on the bottom to a lower elevation. So the museum is built on a grade, and what Stirling does here that was so novel and interesting with its urbanism is actually make this ramp cut through the very heart of the museum, through that sculpture courtyard, from one street to the other. You're not in the museum, but you can still see into the sculpture gallery. Right? You can see into that outdoor gallery. So you traverse the museum without actually being within the gallery space itself. These playful ideas, the use of color, the juxtaposition of all these different geometries, the mixing of glazing types, this kind of playfulness, having a much wider palette of choices, was something that characterizes a postmodern architecture in quite a different way from a modern one. Now, coming along with postmodernism is deconstructivism. And I'd already mentioned that this is a movement that comes out of post-structuralism, because now we can deconstruct texts or buildings down to their sort of fragments. So deconstructivism is an architectural movement that broke through the restraints of traditional building envelope. And they result in structures that sometimes seem almost more sculptural than architectural. Now, where did it really get its name? Well, in 1988, the Museum of Modern Art in New York had an exhibition of deconstructivist architecture, or that's what the curators called it. The exhibit, which was curated by Mark Wigley and, yes, Philip Johnson, labeled a group of designers as being deconstructivist. And the exhibit is considered to have crystallized the movement and brought it fame and renown to the architects chosen as masters of the style. The architects featured in the show were Peter Eisenman, Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid, Rem Koolhaas, Daniel Libeskind, and Bernard Tschumi. While many of these architects distanced themselves from the term deconstructivism, history has recorded them as masters of this style, and we know most of them today because it also launched, in many cases, their careers. The first deconstructivist house was Frank Gehry's Gehry Residence in Santa Monica. This was a pretty typical home that Gehry renovated using chain link aluminum siding in peculiar and unusual ways. You can see the exposed structure, the interesting use of window openings, and of course that juxtaposition of these raw, more industrial materials in a domestic setting that cause people to look and question and wonder. Again, that kind of uncertainty, a little bit unsettling. Gehry would, of course, go on to design many other buildings, the most famous being the Guggenheim in Bilbao. Here's another popular one, the Dancing House in Prague. The building is an interesting example of deconstructivist architecture due to its unusual shape, and also this idea that one of the components of the buildings appears to move into the other. Many people feel it reflects a woman and a man, in this case Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, dancing together. Construction is from 99 concrete panels, each of a different shape and dimension, and each therefore requiring a unique wooden form. This kind of construction would not have been possible prior to CAD, computer-aided design technologies. Bernard Tschumi is another interesting designer included in the show. And here is an important quote of his, Derrida, post-structuralist. Tschumi read him. Many architects followed Derrida's work. And Tschumi quotes Derrida, asking him why architects should be interested in his work, since, Derrida observed, quote, deconstruction is anti-form, anti-hierarchy, anti-structure, the opposite of all that architecture stands for. And Tschumi responded, quote, precisely for this reason, was my response. The project I'm showing you here is La Villette, a park, an urban park in Paris, and it's based on 3 organizing elements: surface, lines, and points. The park consists of 35 red follies, sport and recreation areas, playgrounds, a science and technology museum, and a music center. Schumi was in charge of planning, and in addition to the design of the follies, he superimposed these 3 ordering systems: the points of the follies, the lines of the paths, and the planes of the sports areas. Other designers were brought in to design particular aspects of the park. Schumi's follies were based on a cube and deconstructed. So this should be sort of familiar. This is kind of an Eisenman game as well. And these were deconstructed according to rules of transformation. So for example, repetition, distortion, superimposition, interruption, and fragmentation. All of these transformations were made without any functional considerations. So these projects are not programmatically based. Now, Peter Eisenman went from his sort of cube projects to working on a number of very high-profile projects, but he continued to cast himself as an architect focused on theory. This is the Wexner Center in Columbus, Ohio. Some of you may have visited this site. And you'll remember that you'll see this grid element that comes right out of the building and extends across the university campus. You'll also notice, if you gaze at the image on the right of the facade, how the elements of the architecture appear to be shifted, as though there was a facade and it was taken apart and then reassembled so that it had a different meaning. So another way of thinking about deconstructivism in architecture is that you have a sentence, or you have elements in a building, and if you took the words in a sentence and you reorganized them, it might have a really different meaning, right? The same with these elements of a building. If you had a building and then you took the elements and reassembled them in a new way, you can make new meaning. And this was certainly the objective of many of these designers. Daniel Libeskind is another one of the designers in the show, and this is his Jewish museum in Berlin. The form of this structure does not resemble any museum from history. It reflects instead a mapping of Jewish sites in the city that are then cut like scars on the facade of the building. Rem Koolhaas designed the McCormick Tribune Campus Center, and it incorporates the Chicago L in its design. And you can see there's a 530-foot long stainless tube surrounds the L and sits directly on the building. The single-story structure was completed in 2003, and it was the first building designed by Rem Koolhaas in the United States. So the work that Rem had been doing at the time that he was selected for the Deconstructivist show, he was not even on the international stage at that point, but his selection of his firm to be shown in that show for unbuilt projects put him on the map and has led to his firm's great success, or at least it's one of the ingredients. Zaha Hadid was also included in the show, and many of you are familiar with her work. Here is a project in Vienna, Austria, and here are a series of projects, unrealized, most of these, that you start to see how they're very playful, they're very sculptural in some places. There's a lot of plasticity in the way the surface is molded, and they are all different. They each address their site, their program, their context in very different ways. So we've looked at deconstructivism, and remember, most of these designers would not consider themselves deconstructivists, but we can understand them as having taken the elements of architecture and reworked them to have new meaning and new expression. Another important movement within postmodernism is referred to as phenomenology, and this is the study of subjective experiences. So your senses, what you see, what you taste, what you feel. And it was a philosophical design current in contemporary architecture based on the experience of building materials and their sensory properties. And in fact, there are still designers working today who consider themselves phenomenologists. For example, Stephen Hall. The image I'm showing you here of the Sunslice house is a weekend house designed for an Italian lighting company owner and his family, and it's organized to frame slices of sunlight. For phenomenologists, the design is based on the experience of building materials and their sensory properties, and light was pretty fundamental to how we understand space. While the owner's profession revolves around artificial light, slices of natural light and their change in space throughout the day and year is the focus of this house's design. While most of the elevations are simple rectangles strategically sliced and cut for the play of light within, the north facade is made of glass with views of Lake Garda. In order to emphasize the bends and changes in the strips of sunlight, simple cubic volumes form the basic building geometry. All of these cuts and slices are analyzed as physical and computer models and were fundamental to the development of the house. In these two slides we see some of the models that were built to test the way light would move if one sliced the cubes in different ways. For the phenomenologist, considerations of sight revolve not just around topographic considerations, but also those of light, wind, precipitation, etc. All those elements that create a unique context. Another designer who falls into the phenomenology bracket, or at least is sensitive to these kind of sensorial inputs of space, is Peter Zumthor. He does not, however, consider himself a phenomenologist and would certainly reject this label. And this example I'm showing you here, the St. Bruder Claus Chapel, offers a very different view of architectural production in terms of material, construction method, and use. A little bit of background. This little sanctuary was commissioned by a German farmer to commemorate St. Bruder Claus, a 15th century patron saint, specifically of lumber and wood. The German farmer commissioned Zumthor to design the chapel, and it was then constructed by the farmer and his neighbors. The building process is very interesting. The interior of the chapel room was formed out of 112 tree trunks, which were configured like a tent. In 24 working days, layer after layer of concrete, each layer about 50 centimeters thick, was poured and rammed around the tent-like structure. In Zumthor's book, he goes on and describes the process of the formwork. And then, in the autumn of 2006, a special smoldering fire was kept burning for 3 weeks inside the log tent, after which time the tree trunks were dry and could easily be removed from the concrete shell. The chapel floor was covered with lead, which was melted on site in a crucible and manually ladled onto the floor. I'm going to show you a few slides now of this building. And I want you to consider the idea of approach and promenade of your body moving through space. I'd also like you to consider this within the context of phenomenology. Remember, a philosophy that stresses the experience of building materials and their sensory properties. While we often think of phenomenology as a phenomenon of the 1970s and the writings of Heidegger, it is in fact alive and well today. For phenomenologists, light is of intense importance. How is it captured here? Imagine yourself as a pilgrim in this place. Looking to the oculus, we can see how the logs were used as the formwork for the chapel, and how they've left a unique texture on the interior walls, almost like a grotto. One of the wonderful things about this particular project is that in its design, Zumthor considered not just the site, or the program, or the materials. Yes, he did consider all of those with great care, but he also considered the method of construction and how it would leave its marks on the finished product. In this lecture, we've looked at a variety of architectures that emerge after the end of modernism. And I use the term end of modernism somewhat loosely. As you'll see, and as you know, there's still elements of modernism alive and well, even in some of the projects we've just seen. But what we do see with postmodernism is a much more eclectic, more playful, in some cases more thoughtful architecture that allows for this kind of form to be built, one made of logs burnt out of its shell.